Welcome, I'm James Covey.
And this is Brandi Welterland, and you're listening to Shop Talk with Brandi and James.
Shop Talk is where we combine our shared experiences of living cross-culturally with our work as mental health professionals.
We have over 30 years combined experience living and working in parts of Europe, Central Asia, and Africa, and use this podcast to talk about what it means to live fully integrated and meaningful lives cross-culturally.
We hope that you find our conversations encouraging, educational, and maybe even a little fun, as we share through the lens of our training and experiences, and sometimes interview guests from around the world.
Thanks for listening. So, hey, James, how you doing?
Not too bad. What are we talking about today?
Well, we're going to talk about depression.
And that's as far as everybody's getting in this podcast.
See you guys later. Well, when you and I were talking about different things we wanted to cover in the podcast, it feels like depression is something that most people experience to some degree, and it may not be something that's clinically diagnosable as depression, but it's people may experience depressive symptoms, and especially cross-cultural workers are at a higher risk of experiencing depression. And so it seems like it's a good thing to talk about, a good thing to understand what it is and how to recognize it in yourself, how to recognize it in your loved ones, people you work with. And we're thinking this is going to be at least a 2-part series. We're into series now.
Apparently.
Seems like.
Yeah, there's just so much to cover here. Right before we started recording, I was meeting with a client, a TCK, and she was describing feelings and experiences of the past week, and was like lonely, isolated, sad, a little bit hopeless. I was like, oh, so you would say depressed. Mm-hmm. She's like, well, yeah, I guess. But I think a lot of times we get the fact that depression's feeling also confused with the fact that it's a clinical diagnosis.
Yeah.
And those things aren't necessarily, exclusive with each other.
Right. So thinking about depression, you give a good definition of what depression is. Like, we work with a book called the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, edition 5. It's what psychiatrists use to diagnose mental health disorders.
It is, yeah, it's a manual for mental health. It's important to understand that when we talk about depression, we are going to talk about it as a feeling, but we're also going to talk about it as kind of the clinical side of it, which can mean a lot of different things.
Right.
And it's a really common illness that is experienced. With the WHO says that more than 264 million people are affected by depression. And just to get an idea of what that would be, that would rank number 5 in the global population if you were to pick one country based on population.
Wow.
That's a lot of people.
It is a lot of people.
It would fall between Pakistan and Indonesia.
It's a lot of people. I was looking at the prevalence of depression among cross-cultural workers, and I found this interesting article, and it's from the Journal of Psychology and Theology, and it talks about depression and healthcare cross-cultural workers, but I think it would probably apply to just in general cross-cultural workers. But it says that 32.5% of female cross-cultural workers, 27.5% of male cross-cultural workers report experiencing depression. And that's quite a lot. And so again, this is with healthcare cross-cultural workers, but I don't expect there would be much of a difference with, if you're doing some kind of community investment or things like that I'd expect it to be about the same.
Your depression is different from just usual mood fluctuation and kind of short-lived emotional responses to just challenges in everyday life. We all have times when we have ups and downs and, grief. We experience grief without necessarily being depressed. But especially when long-lasting and with moderate or severe intensity, depression can become a serious health condition. Right. And when we think about in context of clinical depression, yes, it's the feelings of sadness, but often it's characterized by a loss of interest in activities you normally enjoyed. And if we look at the kind of specific things that are part of the diagnostic manual, they are a depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. The second one would be marked by diminished interest or pleasure in all or most activities most of the day and nearly every day.
I was going to add to that, those are also activities that you used to enjoy.
Right.
So maybe you liked gardening.
Going for walks.
Going for walks. And just now it's just like you can't get yourself can't get yourself interested enough to do it.
Yeah, both not being motivated enough to actually do the thing you enjoy, and then when you do it, not finding enjoyment.
Mhm.
Significant weight loss when not dieting, or weight gain, or decrease or increase in appetite nearly every day.
Mhm.
Number 4 would be a slowing down of thought and reduction of physical movement, especially observable by others, not merely subjective feelings of restlessness or being slowed down.
Okay.
5 is fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day, especially one that's not connected to having a really stressful week or being extra physical one particular day at the gym.
Right. You can't necessarily point to something going on with yourself medically or other changes in your day-to-day life that would explain one of these things.
Number 6, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt nearly every day.
Mm.
7 would be diminished ability to think or concentrate, or indecisiveness nearly every day. Then the last one would be reoccurrent thoughts of death, recent reoccurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan, or a suicide attempt, or a specific plan for hurting oneself. And
Mhm.
to meet the diagnostic criteria for depression, you need at least five of these 8 different characteristics.
Right. And they need to impact your daily life also. Um, and we can like get into the parsing out different types of depression, like dysthymia or things like that, which I think would be a different conversation, different day. But when you're looking at like diagnosing depression, it's something that you have these symptoms and they impact your life. So you're not really able to interact with life in the same ways you were before because of these symptoms.
Yeah, and it's easy to see how those symptoms are definitely different than just being sad, or
Mhm.
being down in the dumps would be a phrase that's often used for a short term or a part of your life. And especially different than grief, where it makes sense to feel sad. Sad's not a bad emotion. There aren't good or bad emotions, just those that are more difficult. So I think it's helpful to look at those and say, yeah, actually, there is something a lot more significant in those symptoms in particular.
So you may listen to this and recognize yourself in that, or recognize someone that you're close to, you care about in that. And I wonder, as we talk about this and your experience, James, with living cross culturally and working as a counselor cross culturally, what your experience has been like meeting with people who you might think, I'm pretty sure they're depressed. And do you get pushback from, especially with cross cultural workers, and whether or not they're willing or able to recognize that in themselves?
I get far less pushback when people really are depressed, because by the time they're seeking help, they just can't figure out what's going on. They're
Mm,
not motivated to do anything. For depression, a lot of times it's very much a cycle
mhm,
where men in particular, I find feelings of failure very closely connected with depression and depressive
mm,
symptoms.
mhm,
One particular example, I was working with a guy who just really started getting behind on the project he was working on. And the more behind he got, the less he was able to catch back up, and he was overwhelmed and he was stressed. And he'd had, 20 years on the field, and probably his mental, physical self was also just absolutely worn out, maxed out. And kind of the
mhm,
more he got behind, the more he had thoughts of, I am such a failure, I'm not good at this. And I would call those very shaming thoughts. Shame is, I'm a bad person, different from guilt is, I've made a mistake. So lots of
mm,
shame and self condemnation. And it just kind of built on itself. The more self condemning he had, the more behind he got in work, the harder it was for him to try to get ahead. And it was one of those things where the more time he put at something didn't necessarily result in more stuff getting done.
mm,
His only
mm,
solution was like just to dump more hours at work. But because he had so much difficulty concentrating, he was physically just exhausted. Then he was losing motivation. And the further behind he got, the more difficult it was to imagine himself being to catch up.
mm. So you see this spiral forming
Yeah.
with what's happening in him feeling overwhelmed, and there's so much to catch up on, but then not being able to concentrate on what you're trying to catch up on. So you're expending what feels like a lot more energy and not really making progress with it, which can lead to more shame and just this spiral of just depression and kind of, I don't know, self-loathing sometimes, and why can't I do this? I should be able to do this. Why isn't this happening?
And it's helpful to think of ourselves as fully integrated beings, right? We have a physical part of who we are. We have a mental, we have an emotional, we have a spiritual, and all of these things make up who we are. And a lot of times people will come into counseling and say, well, what I really want to know is what area is this a problem? Like, is this a physical problem? And I just need to go to the doctor and get checked up. I'm like, well, do that no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, is this a spiritual problem? And I need to see a spiritual director. I need to be prayed for. You know, is this a emotional problem? And that's why I'm talking to you. Is this a mental problem? And the answer is always all of the above.
Right. Because our lives don't exist that way. They don't exist in compartments. So, and maybe we just want to have these simple answers like, oh, yes, it's a physical problem. So go do this, get your physical, take these vitamins, and you're great, man. So, but it's a lot more complex than that.
And it's important when we talk about depression, just to be really aware that it does impact all of those areas. There is very much a part of our brain chemistry that can be at play in depression. And one of the reasons we know is because it is super treatable.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
For people that have an imbalance in the neurotransmitters in their brain and they take medication that helps restore that balance, it works. It restores their ability to function, their ability to be motivated to do things, their ability to get up in the morning to carry out their day. And to me, it's such a clear indicator of how successful it is because it works.
Yes. So most of these are called SSRIs. Yes. So selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So what that addresses is your serotonin levels in your neurological system. Some contributing factors to depression could be if you're experiencing prolonged levels of stress and you have these factors in your life that are contributing to that, your serotonin levels are going to go down and they don't bounce back up on their own. And so this type of medication can help in that process to kind of lift those levels up so that you can get your head above water and interact in counseling or interact with people who are speaking into your life. And so sometimes you need the help from the medication in order to be able to understand what's been going on, what's gotten you to this point, and how you can keep moving forward too. So
it just gives your brain a fighting chance.
Right.
Because if you could, for people who are clinically depressed, and we'll talk about some of the different forms of depression, like if they could think their way out of it, they already would have.
They're probably one of the problems.
Yeah, I mean,
thinking about it.
And I think especially in Christian circles, there is this thing where you just need to pray your way out of it. You need to think your way out of it. You need to talk to a pastor. And I think those are important aspects of it, but sometimes that's not enough. Mm-hmm. We need to really respond to our whole being. And for some people, that's medication. And what SSRIs do is they prevent the serotonin from being absorbed back into the body. So they're not doing anything crazy in your brain. They're not giving you anything. They're just kind of blocking your brain taking up that excess, because what happens is there's just not enough of the neurotransmitter serotonin anymore. So those SSRIs just kind of put a little gate on some of those blocks and close the gate so that your body can just rebuild naturally the correct amount of serotonin. And once that happens, it allows people to have the energy to make changes, because actually making a change requires energy, and people that aren't motivated to get out of bed. So imagine having to do then something else.
Right. If you can't get out of bed, but you're required to really look at yourself and look at these hard processes that have been going on with you, the chances of that happening are pretty low. Also, with SSRIs, they've been around for a long time. And with each new generation of SSRIs that come out, they get better and better at specifically addressing serotonin levels, and the side effects that can possibly come with them diminish also. So you can look at SSRIs that came out 50 years ago versus ones that have come out more recently. And the ones that have come out more recently are even better. I think in counseling, we often recommend a combination of the both. And as counselors, we don't prescribe. That is for medical professionals to do. But we found that it can be really effective in helping people get over the hump to where they can start looking forward and processing how to move toward health, mental and emotional, spiritual, physical health.
Another angle at that same thing is most studies have shown SSRIs to be more successful when combined with therapy. So it's the same thing. We don't want people just to go get medication and assume that's going to make everything better, because both your genetic disposition, but also some of how you were living life could have led you into that situation, like being overstressed and burned out. And might be worth listening to our burnout episode if you think about depression being connected to stress and burnout. When you were talking about side effects, it made me think of just recently there was the big Oprah interview with Meghan Markle and Prince
Harry.
Prince Harry. And all of the British people who were watching that were just so shocked at all of the medication commercials. Because that just doesn't happen in the UK and other countries. Because they're like, wouldn't we want our doctor to tell us what medication to take, not some commercial?
I love how at the very end they list all the harmful side effects really quickly. Your eyes will fall out, you'll grow 10 more fingers or things like that. But ask your doctor about it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it just takes time because they're just closing a gate. They're not producing anything by taking the medication. So your brain still has to do the work.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about medication because we think that's the only solution. I often treat people with depression using only therapy, but there's such a stigma, I think, against taking it, and that I really think it's worth us talking about it and kind of normalizing, hey, super helpful. A lot of times I'll start therapy with somebody on depression as a way of kind of assessing where things are at. And sometimes we're able to make improvements. And a lot of it depends on when people get help.
Right. And in an ideal world, you would want someone to have already seen their doctor for physical before coming to therapy, coming to counseling, to rule out any other physical causes, whether it be hypothyroid or hyperthyroid or iron deficiency or various vitamin deficiencies. Like there's other things that can contribute to depressive symptoms. But yes, ideally you would want to just to know what else is going on with them. You had read about the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the symptoms of depression. It's something that's not mentioned there that I think is worth talking about are the physical symptoms that can come along with it. Because you mentioned we're integrated beings. And so our physical beings do not exist apart from our mental and emotional and spiritual beings. And so sometimes when someone is experiencing depression, they can experience physical symptoms too that aren't explainable other ways. It could be digestive problems. It could be headaches, just other strange things. I mean, there really could be something also physically going on. Depression can manifest itself physically. Men can present with symptoms of depression differently from women, not all the time. Sometimes you can see in men, they may experience anger more when they're experiencing depression, whereas women would tend to talk about feeling sad more. And those are it's very big overarching terms I'm using there. It doesn't happen all the time.
I would say for women, isolation. Like you see kind of an internal and external response to depression. And especially in a Western context, we tend to connect that with male and female, but it's definitely not always the case. But those that do have that external expression of depression, it is often seen in anger. So super low frustration tolerance, where very little things make them go off easily. Yelling, anger is often an exterior emotion, and there's a lot of things underneath it. The other way, which oftentimes is with females, but certainly not exclusively, is the more withdrawing and isolating. And the more that people withdraw and turn into that internal world, the easier it is to get stuck in that cycle, because there you are thinking, hey, I'm not any good. I'm worthless. I can't get this done. I feel like a failure. And the more that person stays in that internal world, the more that cycle continues to spiral, feeling less depressed and less motivated to do anything, because when I do stuff, I just feel like a failure. And it just really is hard to get out of.
Right. Yeah, those are some good points to think about. I've also noticed with adolescents, especially with younger adolescents, depression can manifest itself more physically too. James, you touched on some of the stigma with depression as far as medication versus not medication. I know that I've talked to other cross-cultural workers and they almost will kind of hide their face and be like, yeah, I take antidepressants. And it's like people don't want to admit it. And yeah, I would love to be able to normalize that as part of the healing process for a lot of people. For those struggling with depression, for it to be a process that can be talked about, as we tend to, as cross-cultural workers think, well, we shouldn't struggle with depression and we should have these things under control. Whereas talking about it can help us move toward healing a little bit more effectively. Yeah, I just want to normalize talking about it too. Like if you are struggling, to talk to your teammates or talk to your director. There's this great video that I think we're going to link at the end of this called
Definitely.
I Had a Black Dog. And it's such a great picture of what depression feels like for the person experiencing it. But one thing the person says in this video is keeping up an emotional lie is exhausting. And so like if you are struggling with depression, trying to sort of stuff that down or talk yourself out of it or not let others into it is actually a really exhausting process. Oftentimes we don't realize that, or when I talk to people, they don't realize that not being kind of genuine with what's going on internally, it takes just as much work as being genuine and seeking help. But we tend to sort of stigmatize depression, and like if I were having better quiet times or if I was just better at my work and things like that, then I wouldn't be struggling this way.
Another good video we'll link is by a pastor named Tommy Nelson, who talks about his own experience with depression. And it just really changed how he viewed it as really just, people needed to pull themselves up and get on with it. And then his experience with it was just absolutely crippling. And after he went through it and he needed medication to help him be able to function again, he shared just a brief tidbit in it in a sermon. And the response after that was incredible as he found out his secretary, elders at his church, friends, family, people who heard it were all of a sudden now feeling comfortable sharing about, hey, this is something I dealt with too. Yeah, it is one of those things that we do tend to really keep secret. And the more that we talk about it, actually, the more it normalizes both the experience, but also the healing that is a part of getting through it.
Another thing I read as I was reading about cross-cultural workers struggling with depression is pretense separates us from ourselves, from God, and from others. So we can put on this face of like, I've got it together, I'm doing great. But when that really is a face or a mask that we're wearing for others, we tend to withdraw from authentic relationships. It tends to isolate us more. And if you are someone who's struggling with depression, that can contribute to a spiral.
Yeah, it's like you said, there's just a cost for wearing a mask, and we wear masks all the time. Like for some people, anger is a mask that's hiding hurt, disappointment, frustrations related to unmet expectations. If you're trying to understand this mask idea, think about growing up in school. There's probably somebody who was the funny kid in class, and his mask was humor, hiding maybe insecurity. This mask of, hey, I'm really struggling, but I want people to see me as together and as a good fill in the blank, a good worker, a good translator, a good office manager, a good husband, a good wife. These masks of hey, I want to make it look like I'm okay. There's a huge cost for that, not being authentic and vulnerable. Eventually that cost catches up to you. And for a lot of people, they experience depression as just absolutely crippling. And it's often at that point that they get help.
Right. Maybe if someone was able to look at themselves and realize things aren't really going very well, they could do that like several steps back, then the journey toward healing and recovery would not be so arduous and so difficult. If you could start being able to recognize it and just admit it earlier on.
Because it's okay to not be okay.
Right.
We just have this thing, it's not okay to struggle. Actually, no, everybody struggles.
Everybody does. Right. No one gets out of this life pain-free or unscarred by pain.
And I would say nobody gets out of the cross-cultural life without experiencing things like that are just really difficult and challenging and stressful. That's what we sign up for when we decide to move into a situation that is so extremely different than the one we grew up in.
Yes. Yeah. And one article I was reading said, I would expect actually cross-cultural workers to struggle with depression at some point, given the stresses you experience of living cross-culturally and, living with your own expectations, what it should look like, the culture's expectations, what it should look like, your teammates' expectations. Let's go ahead and normalize it. And that's not even saying what we bring of ourselves onto the field. if there are things that we struggled with before that we think, oh, we're going to get out of the field, it's going to be great. Actually, you bring that with you. So if there may be some relationships that you think, well, I'm leaving that behind, I'm leaving that an ocean away. Well, the consequences of that relationship are probably going to follow you and manifest or come out in some way as you're working cross culturally. Be aware of who you are and what you're bringing onto the field, what you're bringing of yourself onto the field, because that self-awareness is going to help you whenever you're dealing with those stressful situations. Mm-hmm.
But what do you think are some helpful things for people who are like, I may be on the edge of experiencing depression, and oftentimes depression comes in episodes. So there's a time for a certain amount of time, weeks or even a month, where you experience those symptoms we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Depression can also be a part of other things like bipolar, which is depression when combined with manic, and mania is a form of kind of the exact opposite of depression, intense arousal, so flight of thoughts, not needing sleep, and it's a huge spectrum. So everything from hypomania, which is just kind of a little bit of an elevated life experience, to full on mania, which when combined with depression is bipolar.
Mm-hmm.
What do people do, especially when we think about the more kind of classic sense of depression and depressive episodes?
Start keeping a journal of how you're doing, like a thought or feeling journal. And as a start for you to recognize in yourself what you're feeling and how intense those feelings are. And if there are patterns that you can see develop throughout the week or even throughout the day. And so start keeping track of that, so that if you do choose to see a professional, for help with depression, that's a good starting point for them to sort of see what's going on with you. And you can recognize too, oh yeah, Mondays tend to be really bad, especially Monday mornings. That's where I tend to feel really low. Or Thursday evenings are great, but that can just help you to see what's going on in yourself. Yeah. What about you?
I think it's good to be aware enough that things aren't okay, and to reach out. If you do recognize early on that, hey, I am starting to lose energy, I'm having this kind of appetite change, weight change, I'm really not able to concentrate and focus, and you're noticing that something's going on, reach out to someone. It could be a friend, it could be a spouse. I think just naming the fact that you're struggling is one of the first and most important things you can do to getting help, is saying, hey, I'm not okay, and I'm going to do something about that. Because change takes energy, and it's a lot easier to manage that while you have energy. While doing that, begin balancing the stress in your life and doing things like margin, where you actually pull back from the amount of things that you're engaging in life, so that you have a little bit of cushion to get some more rest, because sleep is such an important factor in being healthy.
Yeah, you mentioned sleep, and I think just like basic self-care things like sleep, getting out in sunshine, drinking enough water. If you're struggling with depression, those things are not going to make the depression go away, but it's going to help boost you and sort of give you a little bit more margins where you can lift your head up a little bit more and see around you and maybe take the next steps forward too. So just general self-care is it's helpful. Yeah, I would say thinking about keeping track of your emotions, like I think that'd be a good thing to do anytime. Definitely if you're feeling like you're at this point where you feel like you don't know how to move forward and you need to see a counselor, definitely then. Even if you're just feeling a little bit just kind of not great, not really bad, but not great, I would even then just start keeping track of what's going on during your days and how that's affecting you.
Certainly getting counseling is a great way to help. I do a lot of cognitive behavior therapy, which looks at the impact of your thought life and how what you think about is connected to how you feel and what you do. An example of what that looks like with depression is if you're sitting on your couch thinking, I'm just a worthless sack of crap. And pretty much anybody globally who's thinking I am a worthless sack of crap is not going to be feeling good about themselves. So connected to that thought is feeling condemned, isolated, sad, like a failure. And oftentimes people who are feeling those things and thinking those things tend to withdraw and tend to sit on the couch. And
Sure.
depression is such a very inward experience. And one of the things we do with cognitive behavior therapy is begin to really look into those different parts of our life, our thoughts, our feelings, and our behavior, and to engage in each one in a way that's helpful and healthy. And sometimes it's good to have help and external input to do that.
I was thinking about the second episode talking about like counseling, or I was thinking about doing like just talking a lot about automatic thoughts and schemas and
Sure.
maybe attachment or like past or things like that. Like,
and we'll look more into the different types of counseling and ways that you can engage and help with depression when we get back to it next time.
Right.
Another multi-parter.
Great. Looking forward to it. And we hope this is helpful for you. Depression is a heavy topic. But we hope that you recognize some helpful things in there and some helpful ways to move forward, either for yourself or for people who are close to you. James, do you have any recommendations for our listeners?
I think the 2 videos we talked about are great places to start. Certainly the Black Dog. If you're sitting there wondering, man, I wonder if this is me, that's a great place to start. If you watch that video and you're like, wow, this is really helping me understand my experience, then that might be useful for you to know, hey, it's time to actually engage on getting some help on this.
Yeah, I'll say when we lived in Central Asia, I went through a really significant time of depression when we were there. And I remember we had some kind of gathering. She stood up and read that book. And I just went, oh, that's me. So that was part of my process of moving forward. I read a book recently called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. It's by a gal named Lori Gottlieb. Have you heard of that?
No, but I love that title.
She's a therapist, and it's like a memoir where she talks about her experience in therapy. And she talks about some of the people that she worked with too. And she talks about them in general enough terms and kind of mix up their stories. So like she protects their identities and stuff like that. It's such a great window into what counseling is like for her, and also like to be in counseling herself and to counsel other people too. I found it so helpful and refreshing to read. So it's great memoir.
I feel like I say that all the time when people find out I'm a counselor and start telling me about their life. I'm like, you should talk to someone about that.
I'll be your counselor. So she can talk to you.
Thanks so much for being here. If you stuck out an episode on depression, then hopefully we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.